Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let me remove the music and I'll officially first introduce myself and then our speaker, Mr. Steve Holden. We're officially live. I am so grateful to be able to be host these webinars, for the data camp audience and the broader data and AI community. And I'm very excited for today's webinar, and I'll tell you why. There's an extreme amount of excitement around generative AI today, but operationalizing it in the enterprise is quite difficult. And operationalizing it in a large enterprise in an industry like financial services is even harder. And when you think about that, there's no better person to ask today than Steve Holden on how to approach the challenges associated with operationalizing generative AI in the enterprise. And Steve Holden is Senior Vice President and Head of Single Family Analytics and Generative AI at Fannie Mae. He leads a team of data science professionals at Fannie Mae where they support loan underwriting, pricing and acquisition, securitization, loss mitigation, and loan liquidation for the company's multi-trillion dollar single-family mortgage portfolio. He's also responsible for all of their generative AI initiatives across the enterprise. So a lot of insights to gather here on how to program manage a generative AI program in a large enterprise such as Fannie Mae. Steve also previously served as a vice president of credit portfolio management at Fannie Mae. Before joining Fannie Mae in 1999, he held several analytics leadership roles and worked on economic issues at the Economic Strategy Institute and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, before we begin, I'm going to bring on Steve on stage. Steve, it's great to see you.
Great. Hey, Adele. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Likewise. Thank you so much for joining today's session. Now, just before we begin, there's just a couple of housekeeping notes. There will be a Q&A at the end. So make sure to ask your questions in the chat on LinkedIn. We are monitoring the chat. If you want to access the recording, make sure to also register for the event. I will share links to register there. If you want more resources and more learning, I'm also sharing resources in the chat. These include awesome courses, webinars, podcasts that you can check on the topic of the day. My most favorite recent course that I've been taking has been Understanding the EU AI Act course, which is really relevant today. So make sure to check that out. I'm sharing the resources in the chat. And now with that, I'm going to go off screen. And Steve, I'll let you take it away and I'll bring the slides on stage. And yeah, Steve, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Adele. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining today. I think the only other things I'll add about myself before I jump in is I'm an economist by training. I'm not your standard technologist. I do play a role that's largely technical in nature, but my background is in econometrics and statistics, and certainly not in standing up large-scale technology. This is not intended to be a technical talk, so I hope I don't disappoint too many people by saying that, but I really want to describe what's been going on in terms of our efforts to bring generative AI to our enterprise. We're coming up now on the 2-year anniversary of the introduction of ChatGPT by OpenAI, which was really, I think, a transformative moment in sort of technology history. If you look at the 2024 Gartner hype cycle, you're starting to see generative AI turn into the trough of disillusionment. There's a lot of press out there asking questions like, where are the productivity gains? What's going on? And so, it might be quite interesting today to spend a little bit of time talking about what we've been doing and, some of the opportunities that we see and some of the risks that we are navigating. We do believe here at Fannie Mae that there is enormous upside to this technology, but there are some considerable downside risks that need to be managed and mitigated. And so I'll give some sort of color around some of those things as we go along. And I think the other thing that perhaps you should be able to get out of this discussion is some of the things that we've done specifically that have been successful in terms of driving this transformative technology into our organization. And so I'll touch on some things that we found successful, and if those things are interesting or useful to you, that's great. I do want to start, of course, with a disclaimer, which is that this information is contained for informational purposes. So we're not here to give you any kind of legal advice or any sort of other quote unquote professional advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for any specific advice tailored to your unique circumstances. So just a reminder before we get going here. Okay, so I'm going to start and end in the same way today, which is with some mindsets for success. So as I've looked across our program and the approach that we've taken, there are 4 key elements that I just want to emphasize. And then at the very end, I'll come back and I'll touch on the things that we talked about and how they played into these mindsets. So the first is to be outcome driven. And this is super important. And I'll motivate it as we do not have a set of solutions in search of a problem. We're a business, we're trying to solve specific business problems. And the question we ask is, can generative AI help us to accomplish our objectives, to deliver on some of our business intents? And so we're very focused on business outcomes. We're very outcome driven in our approach. Secondly, transparency. The idea that whatever we're doing, we're trying to do it in a way that our employee base can see with maximal transparency the approach we're taking. And I'll motivate why that's important as we go along. Thirdly, there's going to be a pretty deep requirement for innovation happening across the enterprise for us to succeed. And therefore, I consider it really important that the conditions for that innovation to flourish must be set in place. And so as we contemplated our program, we thought a lot about how do we encourage that innovation. And then finally, this is an incredibly dynamic space. If you're paying attention week in and week out, which if you're joining this webinar, you probably are, you know that the technology itself seems to change every week. There's a new announcement, a new capability, a new risk, a new story for something that happened in this area. And so we acknowledge the fact that in an area of such extraordinary dynamism, because we're so early on this journey, we want to be really thoughtful to stay nimble and not to commit too early to any one particular approach, technology, architecture, et cetera. So we're trying to be really sort of thoughtful in terms of our ability to move as new information becomes available. Okay, so with that, I want to talk about the team and actually the entire company through the lens of 3 groups. And you can think of these as personas. And the first is early adopters. And what I found to be incredibly inspiring and interesting is that at Fannie Mae, we have people really interested in this technology across the board. They're in all corners of the company. And these are people who are nights and weekends investigating this technology on their own time with their own computers. These are people who have side of desk projects, who are thinking about their day-to-day and asking how they might rethink their day-to-day responsibilities given the introduction of generative AI as a new technology and capability. And so be aware that you've got these early adopters. Don't think of just your technology team or just your data science team. There are people everywhere that have a lot of interest in this. And the question is, how can you harness that energy? You've also got a group of wait and sees. These are people who are aware of the tech and they're not sure if it's all hype or if it's all real, and time will tell. And so they're going to wait and see. And then thirdly, you've got a group of employees who are concerned about what this technology means, what it means to their roles and their responsibilities in the company, and how that's going to change. And I would argue that group 1 and group 3 are the groups you really want to be focused on. And we spend a lot of our time thinking about how we're engaging those 2 groups and doing so in a productive and effective way. And what I would encourage you all to do, and what we've really done, is harness that enthusiasm and discuss the concerns. And so I'm going to go through these each individually. So let's start with harness the enthusiasm. And I'm going to break it into 2 groups. There's our engineering teams, and then there's our broader employee base. And for the engineering teams, again, you've got groups who are hands on keyboards. They're really interested in exploring this technology. They're thinking about it in the context of their day-to-day. And what we've done with these teams is we've established some guardrails and we've given permission. We've said, it's great that you're interested in this technology, roll up your sleeves, let's see what you can do, but let's do so responsibly. Here are some guardrails to make sure that we do this in the right way within the enterprise. We want to bring this in. We want this work happening inside the walls of the company, and we want to make sure that we can do that effectively. And so I'm going to touch on some specific things that we've done that we found effective on that front. The first thing we did is we centralized the environments where people can operate. And that does a couple of things. First of all, you can inventory all of the activities so you know what's going on. But secondly, getting permission to access different types of tooling and capabilities can be a pretty long, drawn-out process. And by bringing it into one place, getting the approvals set up, making areas available for people to operate within, essentially centralizes that governance whilst enabling you to federate that research. Let the research go to the places where your engineering teams are operating, but making sure that you have them operating in a space that is sanctioned corporately. The second thing that we did is we encouraged in these spaces for engineers to do some conceptual work, build concepts. So think about, if you think about an auto show, for example, right? If you go to the auto show, you see a lot of concept cars. You're not going to see those cars in the showroom a year from now, but some of the capabilities that were built into those concepts do start to show up in the showroom a year from now. And so we're encouraging in this think of it as sort of a science experiment space. We've encouraged these concepts to be built. And in order to create a sense of urgency, we set some dates. And so we announced initially there was a mid-May date that we set up. We've got another one coming up in early October, where we've essentially invited the whole company to an internal conference around generative AI. And so now our engineering teams know that if they can get their concepts up and running by those dates, that they'll have a forum by which to share their work. And so that sense of urgency drives to a solution and gets those concepts to really crystallize into a product. And then finally, knowledge sharing, because this space is so new and changing week in and week out, we've created forums and mechanisms for teams to share their learnings as they go along. And so every 2 weeks we get together for an hour and we have one team come in and talk about their project and really go deep on the engineering and go under the hood and explain how their concepts work. And so this is just about getting knowledge to flow seamlessly through the organization so that we can all learn from one another. So that's on the engineering side. Let's talk about all employees. And there, I would say the two things that we've done is, first of all, educate, and then secondly, ask. And by educate, what I mean is we've gone out to every group in the company and we've sat down with each team for about an hour and a half each. And we've explained what is generative AI, what isn't it, what are the kinds of things it can do, what are the capabilities it unlocks, what are the opportunities. And then we've sat down and we've had those teams who are domain experts in the areas that they represent tell us the ways in which this technology could help them accomplish their objectives. And we've gathered all of that information, and it's a lot. And then we've asked them to prioritize that information. And we've gone through all of that information, all of those ideas and concepts, and we've essentially synthesized it into some themes. And what we found is oftentimes different groups in the company are really looking for very similar capabilities. They just want to deploy them in a different setting. And so we've gathered those themes, and these are now a prioritized set of opportunities. And we've really honed in on, 8 or 9 of these that we believe are going to be the areas that if we can bring some capabilities in-house, whether we buy or we build or some combination, that we can really move the needle in terms of productivity or in terms of accomplishing outcomes that our frontline teams are looking to accomplish. So that's what we call ideation. The second thing we've done, as I mentioned, is we've set up an expo. And while I talked about the concepts as a place for employees to go and explore those concepts is at this expo, We also brought in different teams of experts from different areas of the company to talk about the technology more broadly. And so at our expo that we held back in May, we brought the human resources team in to talk about persona-based curricula for teams to upskill in this world of where AI is emerging and where a different set of skills are going to be needed. And so we've started to think about that and started to engage employees around that. We've also set up a hackathon, which we're going to be running through the month of September. And the way we've thought about a hackathon is very business focused, and we're engaging our business teams. So we've got a group of technical experts, hands on keyboards, who can build things, but we've got business teams and business problems that came out of the ideation sessions, and we're going to unify these teams and set them off on these tasks and have them come back and present at a future expo. So ideation, expos, hackathons are all great ways to engage your employee base, share your learnings, and help you to figure out the places where the largest business needs are going to be in terms of deploying this technology. So that's harness the enthusiasm. Let's talk about discussing the concerns. First of all, for anyone in the company who's going to be touching AI, we've established a set of AI ethical principles. These are pretty standard if you do any kind of searching out online, things like transparency and accountability and explainability, considerations around things like bias. So these aren't things that aren't sort of well understood, but we've made sure that all of our employees who are touching AI understand these ethical AI principles before they ever do any of this work. So that was a sort of a starting point. Secondly, as we've talked about generative AI in particular, we're really clear about what we know and what we don't know, and there's a lot we don't know. And if you think about all of the technology revolutions that have come through over the years, there are certain things that we've seen to be true. For example, we've seen work accelerate through the introduction of new technology, whether it's the introduction of spreadsheets or Google search or the internet or instant messaging. These are all technologies that have accelerated or sped up the way we work. But there's lots we don't know. How exactly generative AI is going to manifest in our day-to-day? What are the things that we are no longer going to need to do? And what are the things that we're going to have to be much better at doing? What are the skills that we will need to grow? What are the skills that are no longer going to be needed? These are all things that we're figuring out today. And so what's important is to be clear about what you know, to be clear about the things you still don't know, but to be engaging in this topic. And as you start to figure things out, to continue that conversation. The third thing I would say is give agency to your employees. And by this, I mean, if you can put the technology into the hands of your teams and ask them what they can do with it or what they would do with it, you're going to get a much better read on what the opportunities are. And so we're finding ways to make the tools accessible and available. We started this with, of course, our developers, where we've given them access to coding productivity tools. We've been using GitHub Copilot here. But having them tell us how this works, what the opportunities are, what's gotten easier, what isn't that relevant, have them tell us the most productive ways to use the technology. And then finally, as I touched on, making sure that we have resources available as we think about upskilling our staff. We're all on, throughout our careers, evolving our skills, learning new things at all times. But there are things that we can do corporately to make sure those resources are available and making sure that we're engaging the team. But if I had to put it all in a nutshell, I would say be in a continual conversation. And as you figure things out, keep that front and center. I write a blog every week. I have about 300 active readers in the company, so it's not everybody. But I can promise you the people that are reading my generative AI blog every week fall into one of those two categories of the sort of early adopters and also the people that are concerned and trying to understand what this means for them. And that's great. Those are the exact people we want to be engaging. That's where we're spending our time from a communications perspective. Okay, risk. Risk is a really interesting topic when it comes to AI. And I'm going to give you the way that I think about risk, which might be a little bit different to how others have thought about it. We at Fannie Mae manage over 100 different types of risk, and we have risk management professionals stacked up against managing those risks, mitigating those risks. And what AI has done, in my view, has changed the very nature of every single risk we manage. And so AI is not a new risk in and of itself. It's just changing all of the risks that we already have been dealing with day in and day out. And I'm going to give you 3 examples to make this point. I'm not going to do an exhaustive review of all the different risks that AI introduces, but I would encourage you to think about what AI is doing against your risk landscape and how you're managing risks. So the first example I want to touch on is data risk. And I'll pick on 2 aspects of data risk: data leakage and data privacy. Now, with the introduction of generative AI, data leakage suddenly has a new frontier to be worried about. And that is that we've got these giant context windows where information can be entered and submitted through an API call, for example, into a large language model. And if you've got an employee looking to summarize a 50-page legal document, for example, to understand the content quickly, a good question to ask, of course, is what's happening to that 50-page legal document that might be private information for the enterprise. And so the use of large language models have just introduced a new frontier of how data can leak from your organization. So that's an example of how, if you manage data risk, you've got to think about how that data is being managed now with with access to these models. Secondly, privacy. One of the nice features of generative AI is search. As we all know, generative AI is highly context aware. And so you can give it a lot of context about the questions you're asking or the information you're trying to gather, and it will give you a much more customized, much more personalized answer. What that means is that if you're looking for some specific information, whereas before with ordinary search, it might not have been that easy to find, with Gen AI, suddenly things that are hidden in sort of the dark corners of your intranet or the internet is going to be much easier to access and locate. And so things like data privacy, where you think you've got your data locked down and well controlled, it might just be that it was hard to find because your search wasn't very good. And your search is about to get much, much better. Let's talk about model risk. I'm an economist, as I mentioned. I've got a background in econometrics. So I think about models sort of very differently from people who've been building AI for a while. And so we're used to models that offer measures of accuracy. If you give a prediction of something, you typically give a confidence interval. I think about hallucinations as estimates without confidence intervals. So if you think about the output of a large language model, it speaks with the same level of confidence, whether it is confident or not in the information that's being provided. And that's very different from what many of us are used to. We're also used to models with handfuls of parameters, and these models have billions, if not a trillion plus. And in fact, with some of these models, you don't even know how many parameters there are because these are third-party models and they haven't disclosed that. We're used to models that are explainable. The introduction of AI models more generally, but specifically generative AI models, lack explainability. In fact, some of the architects of the very architects of these models will tell you that they get results that they can't explain. And finally, we're used to models that are consistent. And the way I would motivate this is if you enter in something as a prompt for a large language model and you get a certain output, you can make a very small rephrasing of that question without changing the semantic meaning of the prompt, and you can get a very different answer. And so that consistency is another problem. Now, these aren't things that are insurmountable. There's a lot of research underway addressing these issues. There are some things that you can do to mitigate some of these risks. But I'm just pointing out that model risk itself, the nature of model risk, changes with the introduction of generative AI. And these are some of the ways that it does. Finally, I'll just touch briefly on reputational risk. As we all know, it's very possible for large language models and other generative AI solutions to produce some fairly harmful material, and that creates risk when it comes to exposing these models externally. And so that's something that needs to be managed. Some things that we've undertaken internally, we do not expose these models externally, certainly not yet. We don't believe that the technology is ready for that. So we're really very focused on internal use cases. We certainly have a human in the loop. Anytime we are deploying these models, there's always an accountable human. We have an inventory of everything that we have underway. We require training in AI ethical principles, as I mentioned. And then we have cross-enterprise communication, stakeholder engagement via an AI council. So we try to bring a lot of transparency into what we have going on. Now, when it comes to managing risk, you have to also think about how to engage your risk partners, because there are going to be lots and lots of ideas, and the aperture through which you can push these ideas from a risk management perspective is only so wide. And so we've set up something that I call pre-governance, but really it's prioritization. And the idea is we do not want to send everything through to our governance resources at the same time, because then we will get nothing done. And so we've set up a prioritization system to only send through a subset of ideas, concepts, use cases that are highest and best used according to some sort of prioritization criteria. And we think about four things. Number one, we think about the risk. We are not interested at this stage in pursuing high-risk generative AI solutions. The second thing we think about is the tech stack. We actually use AWS here at Fannie Mae. We think a lot about whether an idea is going to require us to stray too far from the tech stack that we are comfortable using and that we understand. It's not to say that we wouldn't do it, but we recognize that the resources to do so are greater, and therefore we want to take a careful eye on places where we're deviating from our existing tech stack. Thirdly, business case. We want to understand what exactly the business opportunity is here, and that this is really something that's going to give a reasonable return in some sort of measured way. And I'll touch on ROI a little bit later. And then finally, and this one's really important, uniqueness. What we see across the enterprise is many similar ideas deployed in different settings. And what we're looking to do is understand the full opportunity of generative AI. And therefore, we don't want to essentially pursue the same ideas in different areas and tie up resources getting those things approved when there are unique ideas, different ideas that we haven't yet tested or explored. So we want to make sure that we're really exploring the full set of generative AI capabilities, and we're not focused in on just a narrow group. And so to navigate all of this, we've set up a command center, which is a group of professionals that span a number of organizations. But essentially, the goal is to engage those governance resources efficiently and effectively. Remember that this tech is new. And just like I said earlier, from a risk management perspective, everybody who has a risk management responsibility is trying to understand what generative AI is doing to that risk surface. And so having, understanding that initially it's going to be slow going, but that through time, through the sort of the positive flywheel of continuous improvement, we can engage those resources more and more effectively. Those resources are going to understand better what these risks are and how to manage and mitigate those risks. We're going to start to really get effective at bringing new use cases and concepts through the system. So have an eye to not just what are these risks that we're managing, but how you engage your risk management resources efficiently, effectively. All right, let's talk about ROI. ROI is a really challenging topic, and I've spent a lot of time in various roundtables with senior AI execs across various corporations within the US, and this is a topic that comes up all the time. The first thing I'll say is you need a space for R&D. And I talked about our sandboxes, and there is not a specific requirement up front for ROI on sandbox activity. Think about this as seed money. It's a small amount of funding that enables us to get some work done, to answer some questions, to explore, discover, figure things out before we get to the pilot phase. Now, when you start to pilot your ideas, you're going to start to get, the second you need funding, you're going to start to get questions about what your hypothesis is here, what are you expecting in terms of the benefits, what are the costs, and what sorts of returns are you expecting. And I'll start with benefits can be hard to measure. Some benefits are going to be soft benefits, quality of life type things. But hopefully there are some sort of hard money benefits or hard benefits that you can measure, in addition to things like surveys where you can capture sort of what the worker experience is like when they have access to the technology. But the other thing to remember is it takes time to realize these benefits, because you're building a solution, then you're deploying the solution, and then, you don't want to underestimate this, you need the adoption of that solution. And adoption typically requires people to change behavior, and changing behavior is something that you need to be very deliberate about. And and so change management here becomes really important, so that you can get the maximal benefits out of the use case that you've pursued. Make sure that you really spend some time thinking about how you're going to evangelize and drive that adoption as you figure out those benefits. On the cost side, architecture matters. How you design the solution matters, but also how the tools get used matters. The usage patterns, and you're not going to know up front exactly how much usage you're going to get. You're going to want to design the tools in a way that the usage is efficient, and all of this is going to drive your end state ROI. So measure everything, have an eye to your change management approach, and recognize that this is going to be a little bit noisy. And the thing I would say to be aware of here is it's easy when you adopt an ROI approach to get very short run focused. And you might have some early wins on some things in the short run, but recognize that some of these benefits, because they take time to realize and are hard to measure, they may not show up in an ROI setting as being a great idea early on. And, the way I think about this is we're placing bets, and some of these bets are going to fizzle, and some of these bets are going to have an extraordinary ROI. And we're just going to measure this stuff and track it really closely and be held accountable for what we're doing. But our expectation is not that everything we do is going to work out. And then the final thing I'll touch on is something that we call the AI fabric. And think about this as a maturity model, and think about this as a living document. So it's changing over time, and it's a reference document for people across the enterprise. And so I talked earlier on about ideation, this idea that we've gone out to different groups in the company, we've explained the technology, we've asked them how they would use this technology. And now the question is, how do we go from idea to action? And the risk that you run is, if every group takes every idea and pursues it, aside from the governance issues that I talked about earlier, about how you engage your governance teams efficiently, the other problem that you got to worry about is having a chaotic mix of solutions across the company that become difficult to manage. And so there's sort of a spectrum between defining a single solution that everybody must adopt and allowing complete autonomy in terms of adoption. And our fabric is really closer to the centralized approach, with the sense of we're doing some very specific work to determine for each one of these themes that we've derived from our ideation work. We've gone out, we've figured out there are certain things that we want to pursue. Now we're going to explore them, and we're going to figure out the right technology, be it a buy, be it a build, or some mix. And then as we start to harden that architecture, we start to mature in terms of how we want to solve that problem. We're going to publish that. And as other groups want to use those kinds of capabilities, they have a reference for how the corporation has approached it. And if that turns out to be not a good solution, there should be a decent explanation for why not. But otherwise, we've already got the licenses set up, we've got the capability established, we've got good processes in place to onboard, and we can proceed from there. So our AI fabric is really the way we're operationalizing a lot of this, a lot of these capabilities that we've been building out through time. So I'm going to just end here, and then we'll go to Q&A. I want to end with some of the mindsets that we touched on at the beginning. Be outcome driven. So I talked about talking with every group in the company and making sure that they understand the tech and how that tech can be deployed within their area of domain expertise. I talked about transparency. I blog every week. We have employee expos, internal conferences where we've had incredible engagement across the entire organization. We publish newsletters. We find ways to engage our employees directly on what we're up to so that they understand where we are on our journey, what we know, what we don't know. Creating the conditions for innovation. I talked about sandboxes and making it easy to get access to those by centralizing the governance. I talked about concepts and setting target dates to drive a sense of urgency. We've got a hackathon stood up. I mentioned knowledge shares to get the efficient transfer of information across the organization. And then finally, on don't commit too early, again, just staying really flexible on the technology that you end up aligning to, recognizing it's going to keep changing. Our AI fabric is our representation of where we currently are in terms of the tech that we are testing and adopting. It's a maturity model. It's flexible. It's a living document. It's going to change, and we're designing our work to be nimble and to be able to flex as new information appears. So Adele, I was aiming for 40. I think I'm a hair under 40, so I think I'm about right, and I'm happy to hand it back to the Q&A.
Okay, that was awesome, Steve. Thank you so much for the really, really insightful presentation. I'm just going to remove here the slides. I have a couple of questions for myself, actually, that came up to me before we start taking audience questions. Do everyone make sure to ask as many questions as you want for Steve. We'll make sure to answer them. Maybe one kind of first thing that came up to me, because you mentioned like change management, you mentioned kind of the importance of kind of getting everyone together. How important is executive buy-in when it comes to driving excitement and kind of movement on the generative AI program?
It's really important, and the executives want to see the hard money benefits, like the evidence, and there those examples, those use cases exist, and telling those stories are really important to garner support. And I'll give you a very simple example. We had a case. I won't go into the specifics, but we had a case where we had a firm come in and do some work for us, that was under, a very tight time pressure, and did some very nice work. And then we later asked the question, could we have gotten that work done with a generative AI solution in-house with a couple of engineers and a business expert? And the answer was yes. We actually could have done it a lot more cheaply, which was sort of interesting. So that showed the potential. But as you and I have discussed before, it's easy to show something working, and it's really hard to integrate and scale across an organization. And so if you really want to understand the cost properly, you actually have to factor in that whole like end-to-end deployment. And so we're really in that phase right now of like, we can show that there's a there, right? We can evidence the opportunity, but it's how to kind of deploy it responsibly is sort of where we are. So I think we've got the executive buy-in of like, there's opportunity here. People are really excited about it, but it's just how do you get that deployment responsibly executed?
Okay, that's great. And maybe another question, because I'm very intrigued by this concept of change management. I think it's extremely essential for any kind of transformation program. You mentioned you write your blog. What are kind of, maybe walk us through kind of Steve's philosophy of change management, right? When it comes to communication, like how do you approach communication? How important is it up the list? Like I'd love to kind of get from you your framework.
So who remembers the advent of remote work and COVID, right? So for those of you who were in the office one day and then it was almost overnight you were at home, we at the time were deploying Microsoft Teams. And my group was actually one of the evangelizing teams at Fannie Mae, trying to encourage people to start using Teams. And we were going around the company showcasing how we were using it and how it was changing how we worked and what the benefits were, et cetera, et cetera. And then COVID happened, and suddenly you sort of had no choice, right? Everyone started using Teams. So that was a nice way to get Teams adoption, but without sort of an existential, event like COVID, right? You have to be really deliberate. I always ask the question of, one is, who are my evangelists? And then two is, what are the stories we can tell? So for example, we've been playing around with Microsoft M365 Copilot. So, for Word, for Excel, for the whole Microsoft Office suite. And, I've been using it. I've had some sort of mixed successes. There's been some things that have been pretty neat about it. I came across someone in HR who's also testing Excel and had mentioned that they'd had this really neat breakthrough in Excel. I'm like, oh, like we should make a 5-minute video and share it with everybody. And how do we get those stories out there of the places where, where we're seeing these successes so that everybody can see them? I think that evangelizing is really important if you want to drive a successful adoption program.
Okay, I couldn't agree more here. And maybe I think this kind of segues into my next question, but actually an audience member already asked this question. This is a question from Luca. I raise a question here. It's simple. Who are the main resources suitable for risk and which AI literacy skills they need to have? So, maybe when you think about kind of risk and AI literacy, kind of what does that look like for different folks within the organization? Yeah,
this is a great question. And I think we all fail if we believe there's some AI team that's going to, worry about all these risks. I mean, literally, the way I would say it is as follows. Okay, what is AI? At its core, AI is computers starting to do things that have been traditionally the responsibility, the domain of human beings. Okay, whether it's the ability to look at an image or a photograph and understand what's on it, or whether it's to take voice information and convert it to text. These are all things that now computers can start to do. And so, that's a very concrete, clear thing that we can all understand. And so again, I go back to the risk management section of my talk. And if you're in the position of risk management, you have an obligation, just like all of us do. This is going to affect everybody. This is not a tech thing. This is an everybody thing, right? To really understand what this technology is and what it means. And that's why upskilling is so important, like spending the time to understand this tech. When the internet came along, right? I didn't remember exactly how it played out, but I can assure you, in hindsight, the internet affected all of us, right? The advent of the Excel spreadsheet, or spreadsheets generally, changed the way we do math at work.
Yeah.
I call it arithmetic at scale, right? Like we used to use hand calculators, now we use spreadsheets. So, all these things affect all of us. And so we've all got to take the time to understand it. And we need to make sure there are resources available for people to understand it so that then they can go back to their area of expertise and ask, how is it changing? Because it's changing. And this is one of these sort of step function changes that we're seeing. It's not a gradual thing. It's like suddenly, when ChatGPT got released back in November of 2022, I mean, the world kind of changed. I mean, I realized that, embedding it into all of your processes is going to take some time. And we're all figuring that out. Just like when the internet came along, everything sort of changed gradually as we figured it out. But honestly, everything changed. And so now we've all got to start to think about that and what that means in the context of our work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more here. I think, AI literacy is going to be essential, to be able to manage AI responsibly within the organization for everyone. Another question here from Dan Kaus. Is the AI fabric a catalog of sorts? Would love more details on what exactly that is. So yeah, I'd love if you can expand maybe.
I'll have to figure out a way to kind of, share this more completely as we go. But essentially, when we do all that work to gather ideas from all corners of the company, honestly, it kind of boiled down to a handful of things. Maybe in total 25 things, but really when you prioritize it and you see where most of the energy was, it was around sort of 8 or 9 things. things like knowledge management, things like personal assistant. So there's a variety of things. And one of the things that I'm super excited about with generative AI that I think is going to be transformative is the way that we access data and information. I manage an analytics team. When people have questions, they come to my team, they ask their questions, we do a bunch of work, and we give them answers. And that's going to change because everybody's going to be much closer to the data and able to interrogate the data on a self-service basis. And so, as you think about those different types of capabilities, data interrogation or knowledge management, et cetera, what your eventual long-term architecture is going to look like, you don't know yet.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like 5 years from now, maybe you've got this enterprise-wide knowledge management system, your what used to be your internal search, right? That sort of works, but not really, is suddenly going to be super powerful. But how you get from where we are today to that, I'm making it up, 5-year end state where suddenly information is really easy to get to, that's a journey. And you're going to have to make some architecture decisions. And
Mm-hmm.
I would urge you not just to declare what those are up front and go build it, but actually to do it really thoughtfully. And so the AI fabric is a way to communicate the things that we're pursuing to basically build out that long-term architecture design, recognizing that step one might be we do some pilots, step two we do some MVPs, and then we start to figure it out and then land on a final solution. And even that's not final because again the tech keeps changing, so you've got to be nimble and you've got to be able to adjust. A great example of this is LLMs themselves. Mm-hmm. And how effective they are. And do we need large language models or small language models? Do we need open source, or do we need to use these proprietary third-party models? And all of that's sort of playing out. How effective are these models, and they're the leaderboards, and they change every couple of weeks. Someone's got a new model they released, and suddenly there's an open source model that's just as good as a proprietary. So it's all very, very dynamic. So the fabric is where we are publishing to basically out to the company, like, mm-hmm. Here's what we're recommending. We've done our homework. These are the tools that we brought in. These are the things you can access. You can deviate. It's really an enterprise choice, right? But maybe you can deviate depending on how you guys operate. But you should be really thoughtful if you are, because a lot of work's gone into this, and we've set up accounts and we've set up licenses, et cetera. So that's sort of how we're thinking about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In a lot of ways, kind of reminds me that there's a lot of type 1 decisions you need to make right now if you want to build like an infrastructure. Type 1 decisions are decisions that are hard to reverse versus type 2 decisions that are easy to reverse. So really, really important for everyone rolling out generative AI capabilities. Another question here from Ono Decker. What is meant with sandboxes? I'd love if you can expand on that as well.
Yeah, sure. These are research environments. We actually set up 2, okay, and we gave them a name. The names don't really matter. We called one Innovation and one Insights. Innovation Sandbox was the sandbox we set up that has a lot of tooling, okay, so a lot of capabilities, but no proprietary data in it. So we made lots of large language models and capabilities and various tools and then some public data. It's a place where you can't really get yourself into trouble, okay, and so the governance hurdles are a lot lower, right? It's a lot easier to stand up. These are ours are on like private cloud instances, but again, it drives everybody to the same place. It gives us visibility, it gives us transparency into what's going on, and it creates a space for people and we can manage the costs, monitor the costs, and it gives a place for people to build out their concepts. We have a second sandbox we stood up, which we labeled Insights. Doesn't really matter. But it's the hurdle to get in is a little bit higher. There's a user agreement. There's a manager sign off. There's some training we make you take, including, you have to take the ethical principles no matter what, but also some sandbox training we require. And we also want to see your business case and understand what you're doing in there, because in the Insight Sandbox, we're going to allow some proprietary data. The tooling in there may not be as broad because Bringing in the tooling is a governance exercise, and see earlier comments. So really that's a place where we can start to build out actual solutions that we're going to start to think about deploying. And so again, these are just environments where we bring everybody from all corners of the company who are doing this kind of engineering work, and we bring them to a single place. We've centralized the governance, and we've brought transparency into everything that's happening, so we don't have things happening in different pockets. That's kind of the concept, and it's worked really well for us.
That's awesome. And then maybe one last question from me before we wrap up. I don't see any additional questions. Everyone, if you have any additional questions, let us know. You mentioned at the very early of the chat that, I think we're nearing the trough of disillusionment and the Gartner hype cycle for generative AI. Maybe what does that look like, in your opinion, in the next year or so, kind of when kind of the hype is starting to die down, and how do you see the generative AI hype cycle going?
Yeah, I think this is very normal, by the way. It happens with every technology. And I think there are just unreasonable expectations about. Actually, I don't think it's about what Gen AI can deliver. I'm pretty bullish on what Gen AI is going to do. I think it's going to be transformative. But I think the pace at which this is going to start to show up is a lot longer than maybe the expectations that have been set. And the reason why, I mean, let me give you one way to think about this. One of the things that Gen AI really changes is the human-computer interface. So if you think about any process you have in a company, and all companies are just a bunch of workflow processes at some sort of distilled level, right? So we have lots and lots of processes here that we follow, and different places where humans and computers are interfacing in regularized and structured ways. And Gen AI is going to upend that. It's going to change all of that. Like integration as a thing is going to be, I believe, especially we have human-computer integration, it's going to be much easier.
Yeah.
But it's going to require some re-architecting of how you operate. And that's just not happening overnight, especially with the backdrop of the risks. And the fact that these risks are all being sort of figured out on the fly here by all these engineers, that are building the models and testing the models. I mean, we haven't even talked about agents, but agents are another thing. I mean, my understanding of agents is they're fairly brittle. Like it's easy to break an agent and to sort of cause some mayhem. But the possibility of having agentic frameworks, of having agents really, running elements of your workflow are going to be transformational, but it's not happening overnight. And I think, the hype is, you see this thing, it goes back to an earlier point I made, which is you see a thing and it's amazing and you realize it's going to change a lot, but taking something that works and deploying it, again, integrating it and scaling it is really hard.
Yeah,
and it's going to happen, but it's going to take time. And once you get there, I think it's going to be a new world, but it's going to take time. And I think we have to be clear-eyed about that. And if we aren't clear-eyed about it, then we're going to have unmet expectations.
I couldn't agree more. A great example is electrification, for example, right? Like electricity was invented, it took decades to build the grid, right? And here we are building our own grid. Yeah. Awesome. So I think this is it for questions. Steve, thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. Everyone, do check out the recording in case, do make sure to register. The links are in the chat in case you want to access the recording. Check out the resources, check out the EU AI Act course. I have been thoroughly enjoying it. And with that, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today. I really, really appreciate it.
Great to be here.